Welcome to Complex Creatures, exploring spirituality and the common good.
Well, hello. Welcome to Complicated Creatures, exploring spirituality and the common good. I'm Jarrod Longbonds. I don't know if I say this often, but I'm a minister of a church in Midtown Atlanta called Peachtree Christian Church. I have a PhD in theology. Now, I've written a lot on the doctrine of creation, ecological crisis, ecological philosophies, but I also love exploring questions of pop culture, like questions about monsters and why they're interesting to us, and questions about how media forms us. And so I'm just curious about a lot of things, frankly. And in no small part, I'm also curious about spirituality. This podcast is an attempt to explore how spirituality and tools associated with spirituality, whether that comes from the Christian, the Jewish, the broader, just wider world of spirituality, or the 12-step program, just the world of spirituality, how it may have tools that are under-tapped and underutilized in exploring the common good. Often spirituality is relegated to the personal development, but we think that there are some tools that it has that can help with just how we engage each other in this world. At the time that we're recording this, as I'm with my good buddy and producer Alan, we are in the wake of an attempted assassination upon President Donald Trump at one of his rallies in Pennsylvania. We're actually recording this on I think the final day of the Republican National Convention, and I know very well that the Democrats are working questions about Biden and questions about their convention, but all of this tension and the concern and just the sheer hatred and anger and fear and all the stuff that's just surrounding and fomenting our culture made me think today to think about the stories we tell ourselves and the stories we live by. There is a spirituality to storytelling. Sometimes the stories we tell are pretty obvious. We tell moral tales and fables. We tell narratives. We create films, write books, do comic books. We tell stories a lot, and those are pretty obvious. Those are intentional fireside stories, stories you tell at the campfire and so on. And then there's the stories that we tell in various means and modes, and we live by, and they're not necessarily conscious. They're sitting there in the psyche. They're the smaller stories that fuel how we think about ourselves, our place in the world, and others. Sometimes they're born out of mottos that we learned as kids or other larger narratives. Sometimes they're things we picked up through marketing. Sometimes they're just the twisted or helpful thoughts that we've had and rehearsed when we couldn't sleep at night. So I want to talk about stories. Before I kick it off, I just want to turn it over to Alan, just my good buddy who's an avid storyteller. How important are stories for you when you think about being a creator of them, and when you think about being a father? When you hear that word story, is it something that excites you? Is it something that you think intentionally about? Just tell me what you think about stories.
So, I don't want to get too far into it because that's a huge question, my friend.
Yeah, it is. It wasn't small.
So I think storytelling is central to who we are as humans. I think that humans communicate through story. I think humans communicate most effectively through story, and I think that storytelling is the central skill to leadership. And I think storytelling is the central skill to effectively trying to work through change in lives.
I think that's very accurate. There's a theologian and ethicist that worked mostly at Duke, but also Notre Dame, named Stanley Hauerwas. For those of you in the know of Christian theology, Stanley Hauerwas is kind of a polarizing figure. People either love him or they really struggle with him. His work has done a lot to form and shape me. And I believe it was him who actually said that as humans, we are story formed creatures. That's just one phrase that he said before that makes a lot of sense to me. And the way he describes the modern world, he's got a very mantra sort of quip where he says, like, who told you the story that you had no story? Or who told you that you only had a story? Oh, I don't know how I'm going to mess it up. But he basically says, like, the modern world is the story that you made up your own story when you discovered you had no story, or something to that effect. The idea being that the modern world that we live in is that intellectual cultural era is the time of the right now that has separated itself from what's come before. Every other era in human history has been named after the fact by people looking back. Oh, that was the Renaissance, or oh, that was the Baroque, or, but the modern period is the one where it's thinkers and cultural leaders said, we're modern, we're right now. And in a sense, they cut themselves off from prior narratives and traditions and authority structures. And it was, in a sense, an attempt to create who we are right now. I believe it was Bruno Latour, the French social theorist, philosopher of science. His family was of the famous Latour family of winemakers in France. Bruno Latour said something like, the modern world is the one where we're progressing forward, but doing so backwards, only looking to see what we're extricating ourselves from in the past, and at the same time, not seeing all the destruction we're causing along the way, which is a scathing critique of the way the modern goes. But back to Hauerwas for a second, his whole point is that it is, in fact, a story that we're telling ourselves, that we need to come up with some new story to define ourselves. And so in a large way, in a big kind of deep human cultural way, we are story formed, and we desperately need to tell a story. Even if that story says that we don't have stories, that itself is a story that tells us about our place in the world. Today, and for the questions of polarization, political fighting, and maybe just the way we otherize each other, which is not a great word, but it's a word I use often. We otherize and demonize. I like to think about the smaller stories that I think a lot of times we're just not aware that we're living. And so one story, it goes a little like this. Maybe you've heard some of these or said them. They usually come out in more subtle ways than some grand narrative. There's one story that follows the pattern, if only. It is a story about happiness or a version of the good life, but if only I had this thing. In a very small way, as consumers, we're manipulated into feeling like that. If only I had a house with an extra bathroom, well, then I would feel better about my place in the world, right? We usually probably don't say it in such stark ways because we know how we can easily criticize and critique and question those assumptions. If only I had a new pair of sneakers. Well, yeah, we know that a pair of sneakers is going to make you, quote unquote, happy for a very short period of time. In fact, the data is in the way that we engage things and objects like an object stores. We really, 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 really want them until we have them in the shopping cart, and then how much we want them lessens really quickly over time until we find the next thing we really, really want. So we know that doesn't really have veracity in our life, but we still are tricked into feeling that way. If only this, then I would be happy. And the way that story shapes us morally when it comes to other people often follows this kind of version of the story. If only they were not in charge, then things would be right. Or if only I were in charge or my people were in charge, then things would be right. Now you hear those two, Alan. Just tell me your knee-jerk reaction. How do you feel about those stories? If only they weren't in charge, or if only I were in charge, then things would be fixed or right or good.
The funny thing about that is that we have seen the other be in charge at various times, and not everything is right or fixed. And in fact, even in my own life, when when I have finally been able to be in charge, because I have definitely told myself this many times, especially in my academic career. When I'm finally in charge, no, I still have lots to figure out, my friend.
Right. So, yeah, just I think if we don't have a bias towards the future in a way that cuts us off from our lived experience, we'll know that by lived experience that hasn't been the case. That even when we are happy enough to have the person in charge that we want in charge, whether it's politics or the person running our sports favorite sports team. I mean, on grand, like, national level, it's like if this party were out of office and this one were in, then things would be sorted in a very, like, personal kind of silly way, but still tribalistic. If only our coach were fired, who's the worst coach ever, and we hired this person instead as our coach. In both cases, in reality, nothing is ever perfect. Nothing ever lines up perfectly, or at least not all the time. And life is so filled with difficulty and challenge and problems. That is part of the nature of life, that things won't always go the way we want them to. So the story, when analyzed with just a moment, we know isn't true. Yet we still rehearse it and practice it in our minds. Like, what I'm suggesting, spiritual component to it, what I'm suggesting is I know that story's not true, yet whether I say it in my mind and rehearse the sentence structure or not, it still has a way of being present in my mind. It's still, there's residue of it, and it works on a almost less than a linguistic mental level. Like, that means, like, thinking of words and sentences, and it works more on an emotional level, almost like at a deeper part of the brain where it's just guttural and just feel it. And if they were removed from the situation, then it would be better. And it seems to me the only way to overcome a story like that, well, maybe not the only way, but it seems to me that we at least need to be intentional about overcoming stories like that. And maybe one of the ways to do it is to replace it with better stories. How do we replace one story with another? You ever feel like stories can become habitual, Alan? They can have, like, grooves in a record.
Yeah, in fact, just in classical storytelling, I think we do that all the time. Romeo and Juliet is not an original story to Shakespeare. It's a retold invention, and we keep retelling it to ourselves in various ways.
Now, that's something I'm not aware of. What do you mean it's not a story in Shakespeare? You just mean like the narrative structure?
No. It's actually plot wise, it's almost entirely taken from a previous play called the Tragical Tale of Romulus and Juliet, or something to that effect.
Oh, okay.
So he just reworked it and added some dialogue to it and rethought exactly how the character arcs worked. But the entire story itself is not original to Shakespeare.
Yeah, there's theories out there about there's only a certain amount of stories that we tell. We tell them in different ways. We dress them up differently, but there's only a certain amount of stories that are available to us that humans are seeming to tell. And so, your narrative structure might be, the underdog is overcoming or something like that. There's simple narratives that we do rehearse and tell and tell and tell. And they do shape the way we see the world. As much as we create them out of our mind, they also there's like a feedback, and they shape the way we think about the world. I think this is certainly the case with just in kind of some unhealthy ways, the way we think about ourselves. And I've seen it a lot with people who are suffering from forms of some sort of self-criticism. As someone who's worked with kids before, I've seen some kids get upset at themselves and just repeat over in a corner, I'm stupid, or you're stupid. And certainly if we hear something enough, it's going to affect us in a way. And then if we are saying it enough, it's going to affect us maybe in a deeper way or in another way. But nevertheless, those stories can begin to take hold. And I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not going to say how it works, but it definitely is something that gets deep into us, and becomes a habitual thought. And then so much about how then we behave in the world comes about because of the habits we formed. I think that we really need to think about how fast life is. A conversation is pretty quick. I mean, how many times have you walked away? I mean, you ever walked away from a conversation where you think, I wish I said this instead?
Nearly every one of
them. Nearly every one of them? That's like my torture right there. Like, why did I say this? I should have said this, or I wish I had said that. And of course, so often we don't have the words called to mind right away. That's because, I mean, maybe in some people are quicker at thinking on their feet, but in reality, life is happening at a pretty fast pace. Conversations happening pretty quickly. What would you do if you saw a shooter at a political rally? That's a question that people often think about when they find themselves reflecting on news stories like we've seen recently in our own country. What would I have done? Would I have notified the authorities? Would I have stepped up? Would I have done something myself? And the truth is we probably don't know how we would react to something pretty intense in a very short span of time. Life happens really fast, and the only way to be ready, I think, for life, and I'm not just talking about the extreme moments now, but the only way to be ready for life is to have practiced certain practices of virtue which become habitual, so that when things happen on a moment's notice, our natural response or our instinctual response is based on the habit that was formed in virtue, how the virtue's thinking. So when it comes to there's simply starting with the stories we tell, I think what we need to be thinking instead of rehearsing bad thoughts is, once we realize we have a bad story, once we've identified it, we could talk about how we know we have bad stories in a moment, but once we've identified it, we need to start thinking about better, more virtuous, or more truthful stories to rehearse instead, so they can become habituated in us, so that when life happens quickly, hopefully our response to other people and circumstances are more virtuous or more faithful to other people's dignity and value. Does that make sense, Alan, to you?
100%. I mean, there was a time in my life when I used to literally look in the mirror and say, my life sucks. And then eventually I started saying, I used to tag it with, but it's getting better. And then eventually I was able to rework that narrative. And I think some of the ways that you're describing right now.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That's very vulnerable of you to say that you had that period of time. And I think that's very strong of you to then add the tag, but it's getting better. That's wise. Just that subtle reframing opens a door and opens a little light into your situation. I find that the stories that we are telling, they are spiritual, but they also help to form something of a worldview. So when we tell stories like, if only I had this, then I would be happy. What it's implying is what's wrong. It's giving us the answer to the question of what is wrong with the universe, or what is wrong with my life and my part of the story. And then the answer is, well, if I just had this, then things would be better, or that would be the solution, which, again, that's very laughable. We know that those things wouldn't solve the problem, but it is identifying, whether we know it or not, a problem. And if we have the question, the story, if only they were not in charge, or if I were, then we're identifying a different problem. What's wrong with the state of affairs in the world? If it's just at work, then it's what's wrong with work. But if it's about like things like our nation, then we're saying, well, what is broken about the system that we are all swimming in, the stream that we're all in here? What is wrong with it? And then it also offers the question of what is the solution. So it's a profound one, and I like that you were able to identify that story for yourself, and then add something to it, and then work your way through it. There are other stories I find that are common ones. What about you, though? Before I enumerate any others, are there some stories that you think that are kind of quiet in the mind, or even under the mind, or under the verbal construction part of our thinking, just down the emotional level, the stories that may be at play that affect the way we act in the public sphere, or the way we engage people who are different than us?
Well, I think that everyone is made up of experiences, and I think that everyone has things that they have experienced, and therefore they use those experiences to tell them how the world works. I'll tell you one that was challenging for me as fast as I can spit it out here. Um, I When I was 6 years old, there was a little boy in the neighborhood who came over to play with me, and we were playing with Star Wars figures, right? And after we were playing, when I went to put my Star Wars figures away, one of these things was missing. And I mentioned it to, there were two little boys who were there. I mentioned it to the first little boy because he was still there. The other little boy had already left. And Michael, the kid that I mentioned it to, immediately jumped to the conclusion that the other kid had stolen it, you know? And I was like, I'm not sure he stole it. Maybe he just stuck it in his pocket. Maybe we left it in the backyard somewhere. I mean, whatever. Let's try to find it. So anyway, we went over to the other kid's house and we said, hey, I'm missing the Star Wars figure. Do you have it? And he started crying, and he pulled it out of his pocket and he threw it on the ground and slammed the door. And his brother came out after that and basically told us that the fact that we thought that he had stolen this indicated that we were prejudiced, because this little kid that I'm telling you about was a black kid, and me and Michael were both white kids. And to be honest with you, that was the very first time that I had ever even thought about this as a concept, because I was privileged enough to never have to think about it as a concept, you know? And that really stayed with me as part of the I don't understand this. I need to be thinking about it harder over time. But realistically, there's definitely another part of the narrative there that stuck with me, which is, hey, he's accusing me of being a racist, and I don't even know what that means, kind of a thing. And maybe I was at that time. Maybe I still am. I don't know. I'm still trying to figure all that out. And as a middle-aged white dude, I'm not sure I have the right to determine some of those things.
Well, thank you for sharing that. That's also another vulnerable story. And has that become reinforced in you in a way that you think is helpful, or a harmful way for you?
I think at one point in my life it was a harmful way, but I think later in life, looking back on it, it made me really aware of the privilege that I have, that I didn't even know was privilege,
Yes. We often, so in this, yours is a very specific story. The ones I was telling were very general, but that what it's done is it did reveal to you that you were up, your storytelling, your personal point of view about the world came with a thing that you didn't realize you had, which is this certain sense of privilege in the culture. And that's a profound thing that right now I find that reckoning is hard for white folks to handle. I just think when it comes to the issue of race, when I bring it up in my church context, you either have people who are just totally on, they're totally nodding. Yes, racism is not just interpersonal between human beings; it's also systemic. And yes, people who are of quote unquote of color are started with, but on the starting blocks were further back than were people who are considered white. Yes, blackness and whiteness are social constructions. There was once nothing considered called whiteness. We were all different and different. We're more ethnic and nationalistic from our backgrounds, and in fact, early Irish and early Italian immigrants and Jewish immigrants were not, quote unquote, what is considered white. And all these nuanced things that you want to talk about. There are people nodding their heads, and then there's other people who really struggle with it. And I hear them. They just want to say, you know what, we dealt with this. We've gone through civil rights. This was painful. This was agonizing. And I try not to smirk. I try not to laugh at them, because I'm thinking, you were a white person. Was it really that hard for you? And no, it's comparably not more difficult or even near as difficult for them as it was for their contemporaries who were of color. However, they did go through some sort of social reckoning and change that was societally challenging. They felt those are real challenges. They felt that change, and they liked for nothing more than for it to just simply be over with. And now they're being told, no, there's deeper underlying systemic issues here. And then they come to me and say, well, can't we just say that this has been dealt with? We've done that. We're against racism. Let's move on. And they're having a hard time seeing that point of view already starts from a place of privilege. It's a point of view that thinks that everyone started in a neutral space. It makes me think of a time where I was working a summer job for my uncle's, cleaning company. We cleaned carpets and floors. We did fire damage restoration. We did water damage restoration. And quite frankly, this was a very physically demanding job. And it was me and my supervisor's an African-American person. Every day I'd go to his home for lunch, and every day he would drive me home and pick me up, and we'd go to his neighborhood, which was more in the inner city. And as we drove from there to my house, we'd cross the bridge and head out near the lake and to more a suburban feel. And he'd always comment about the police in his neighborhood, and he didn't have kind words to say about the police. And then as he would drive me by my house, he'd say, look at this, there's no police. And, I was a 15-year-old kid. He was my friend. He was friends with me. He was kind to me. I was kind to him. We liked each other. There was no interpersonal racism. But I remember saying to him rather naively, I said, well, yeah, there's no police here because there's no crime here. But the neighborhood that you're talking about, there's more crime. And he shook his head at me. And then he began to tell me about how many times the police came looking for somebody in his area and harassed his father and his uncle on the front porch who were just sitting there minding their own business and this, that, and the other. Now, I'm going into this broader story because I can imagine people hearing that, and some people shaking their head at my naivete, and then I can imagine other people saying, well, yes, but their police were only ever in those neighborhoods in the first place because that's where the crimes were committed or something like that. But I realized in that moment, I did not know what it was like for my father, my uncles, my grandfather, just to be harassed or frequently questioned by police because we sat on the front porch. I also didn't know what it was like to walk my neighborhood and always see police cars. I didn't know what it was like to be questioned on a daily basis because I was walking my streets in the neighborhood. And all of a sudden I started slowly seeing that we didn't start from the same place at all. And my place had a sense of privilege. Now, again, that's a specific story like yours. It's not as generalized as just if only, but it is a story that was deep down inside of me, that story that came from that privileged place that told me how to see that neighborhood versus my neighborhood. But a little bit more illumination that he gave me and some experience and time that I received in these past, 30 plus years is shown me that there are deeper stories, deeper social realities. And I need to keep investigating my assumptions, my stories.
Right.
I need to keep in touch to find out, are they helpful or are they harmful to my own spiritual experience and to the way I socially and ethically relate to the world. And I think that really takes the turn to where we're going spiritually. We as spiritual beings, moral beings, would do well in this world if we were assessing our stories. We're going to have them for good or for ill. They're going to shape us for good or for ill. And that's fine. Some stories you receive. You're going to be hard pressed not to have something of what your mom and dad tell you since you're a child. If your mom and dad tell you, let's take it away from race for a moment. You go down to my father, who said to me all the time, he told me that if people say, trust me, don't trust them. So whenever someone tells me something, they want me to believe, say, just trust me. Immediately my antennas go up because of what my dad said as a kid, that only people who are untrustworthy need to be told, need to ask for trust. That may or may not be true for everyone saying that to me, but it really has been ingrained into me. Another story he always said is, it's a one that a lot of dads tell their sons. It's okay to talk, but you got to walk the walk. In fact, my dad would say, I don't like people who talk. I just want to see people who walk. My dad was never, ever interested in people making promises. If you were upset because someone transgressed, don't ever say, I'll never do it again to my dad. Just show him. And over time, you'll start slowly building up trust. But just show him, don't talk. If you talk, you go, yeah. It never meant a thing to him. That story has shaped how I feel. It's the reason why I don't make certain promises. I'll never do this. I get really worried about making those promises because it matters. But I know another person whose dad taught him, do what you fear, which sounds noble because you should stand up to things that will frighten you. But it led him to make some decisions to put himself in the most fearful position, the most dangerous position he could imagine. But it was an unwise situation. So that story had its own way of working its way in and shaping the way he saw his place in the world and what he should do to be right, what he should do to be whole. And it made him do unwise things. So it's really important for us to be analyzing our stories, to be checking ourselves, to be asking what are our assumptions and what does it imply about other people. I think that's the spiritual component that really lends itself to the common good. If our stories are demonizing other people, if our stories are making other people out to be less than human, if they're dehumanizing stories, then they are stories of danger. And I think that our political talking space right now is full of that. It is full of assuming people from other vantage points and ideological points of view are subhuman by the language we use to speak. And if we say it enough,
right,
well, actions follow pretty easily, right?
Pretty profoundly.
So how do you check your stories? Alan, have you ever thought about, I don't even, sometimes throwing this out to you just kind of on the fly. How do you check them? Has that ever occurred to you? Do you have a way of checking your stories? Do you have any spiritual practices yourself or anything helpful?
Man, that's a great question. I don't think that I'm as conscious of my my stories as you're describing them as I need to be. Number one, but number two, I think that experience is mostly what has caused me to check the stories that I have. Going back to the racism issue, years and years and years after the story that I just told you, I had an experience where I was the bass player in this band called Beehive. It was three brothers and me, and I was the white boy on bass, and it was a funk band, and the lead singer of the band used to take great delight on stage in slapping me on the butt and going, "Dance, white boy, dance." But anyway, I'm telling you the story to say that a lot of things that I had told myself about my black brothers were really challenged in that time in my life, and a lot of things that a lot of narratives I believed as a result of the earlier story and other things were really challenged as a result of that experience in my life. And a lot of things that I thought were good about me turned out to be terrible about me. and I learned it at that period in my life. And I think those experiences have mostly challenged my stories. But I love what you're talking about right now, where there's like a conscious spiritual practice of challenging your stories. Tell me more about that.
Yeah. So yeah, I'd love to talk more about that. And I love the fact that what you're doing is your experiences with otherness have been a reflection to you. It is important for us to be around people who are not simply like us, from one way or another, so that we can expand our understanding. We can only know other stories by hearing other stories. We can only know different perspectives really from really leaning in. But some spiritual practices, the first practice I'm going to suggest is really almost so simple, it's foolish. It's going to be foolish sounding. And that is friendships. I think we take friendships as a very naturalistic and maybe just a simplistic sort of social thing in the world that's just not even worth thinking about. But I mean, Aristotle wrote about friendship. Great theologians have written on friendship. Friendship is actually kind of a rather dense and profound concept, existentially and intellectually. I mean, in all ways. But I think cultivating friendship. When we cultivate friendship, it's beyond just being around people who share the same interests. That may be how it starts, but a cultivated friendship is something that is like marriage. It's worked toward and worked on. And I think finding friends who will tell you the truth. I think finding friends who will who actually don't just tell you the truth, but actually see you and get to know you enough to be able to help you realize when you're deluding yourself. And we have friendships and relationships in life where people will just help us continue on our self-delusions. Where people, I think psychologically we might call that some sense of codependency. And marriages can do that too, but I think a real relationship is born out of intimacy, and that's only comes through time and experience. When people can actually see between the words we're saying to know when we're fooling ourselves or letting ourselves off the hook. And I'll tell you a story about friendship, and then don't let me forget to come to other practices. But it's a story I tell so often. But my friend, one of my best friends, Dan, called me one night, this several years ago, and I was having a hard time, being in a job like mine where you're leading a congregation is not easy, and then leading a historic congregation, many generations of people, it's just challenging. And I was having a hard time. It just stuff was tough. I was sitting up on a Sunday night alone, just kind of feeling the pull, and the pain of just all of it. And he called me, and I started telling him how I was feeling, telling him experiences I had, something, the death by 1,000 cuts of criticisms and things. And at some point he said to me, "You're not being very nice to my friend." And the genius thing he did there is he separated me from myself in a way, or my headspace and my storytelling, where I'm not good enough, I'm not smart enough, I'm dumb, all these criticisms that I was saying about myself based on how I was feeling. And he prioritized his relationship with me over my own headspace by saying, "You're not being very nice to my friend." And he says, "I need you to be nice to my friend." And in that sense, he stood up to me, for me. And the next day he sent me a song by the singer-songwriter Andrew Peterson, and I was sitting in my office, and the song is he performs it with his daughter and his son, and it's based on stuff he said to his daughter one night when she was having a hard time. And it's called "Be Kind to Yourself." And in there's a line that says, "How does it end when the war that you're in is just with you against you against you? You got to learn to love your enemies too." And that's a story I don't really tell myself. I tell myself that story from the scriptures about loving your enemy as yourself, loving your neighbor as yourself, but loving your enemies too. I never tell it in a way that reminds me that sometimes I'm my own enemy. And if I'm my own enemy sitting, I love myself, well, there is a different story there. So good, intentional, cultivated friendships. I'm going to see if you have anything to say about that or questions before I move on to another practice, just because, friendships isn't a small thing. That's a big thing.
No. I mean, I think that when I'm talking about experience, I am talking about friendship and allowing those influences in your life to help you understand things from a different point of view. I think that's exactly what I'm talking about. I can't wait to hear what your other spiritual tools are.
Well, okay, here's a great one. So forms of contemplation and forms of meditation and forms of mindfulness. These are things that are persistent throughout various traditions of spirituality. But there's one form that I'd like to talk about now that is based on a 20th century Japanese, I believe it came out of kind of a business psychology world called Nikon. And in English, it's spelled Naikan. Nikon is this Japanese style of self-reflection. The guy, I can't recall the guy's name who developed it, but he was a Pure Land Buddhist, which is a pretty traditional form of Buddhism. And these are the three questions that Nikon has people reflect on are profound questions, and you can reflect on them every morning, every night. You can journal about them. You can do a retreat, a 3-day retreat, where each day you focus on one question. You can fold them in your life in different ways. But here they go. And there's two reasons why this is profound. One is that it elicits gratitude, and gratitude is a disposition that becomes that comes out of a story of abundance, and not a story out of scarcity. So the economy of our culture runs on a scarcity story, that there's not enough, we have to compete for resources. Spiritually speaking, most spiritual traditions preach an economy of abundance. There's more than enough. Wendell Berry, the agrarian poet, farmer, essayist, novelist, said, everything we need is already here. Right? There's more than enough. Contrary to Elon Musk, we do not have to abandon Earth for Mars for resources. There is more than enough. Just learn to use it right. That's the story you tell has implications. Anyway, so gratitude is a contrary story of abundance. The second reason why this is profound is that I think I just dropped it for my long explanation. But let me get to the questions, and maybe the second reason will come up. But here it goes. First question. What have I received? What have I received? Start writing down the things that you've received, right? I can hear someone say, count your blessings, name them one by one, that old little Bible school song, or, this is simple gratitude journaling, or whatever it is, but just write, what have you received? What have you been given in life? And the thing is if you get specific about it, that list becomes endless and very hard to enumerate. So it's not just that you've received food, but I bet most people don't eat the same thing every day. I bet you have options. It's not just that you have clothes, but look at all the clothes that you do have. I mean, someone gave you this gift of this book, and it's not just by the way, it's not just this book that someone gave me, but I'm so thankful. I because of the paper that someone had milled, and it came from a tree, and the ink that was made, hopefully today's ink is based in soy. You just go on and on down the list. I have HVAC, and we're in a heat wave down here in Atlanta, Georgia. I've got clean water, and it just goes on and on and on. And then you can think about what's your mother and your father and your friend and your partner and your children gave you a hug this morning. You just go on and on. The dog gave you a nice little cuddle on the floor. I mean, I don't know what it is, but it just goes on and on and on. When you fry an egg, I received this egg from a chicken, and I received the heat, and I got, all of this is something that you fully can't account for. Even if you paid for something, you fully can't account for just about anything. And that becomes a pretty big list, which then should elicit some form of gratitude, which then tells you that story of abundance, right? It's a different story than the story of scarcity. Second question, what have I given? And you could even start with what I've given, and then probably it'll probably be more startling to you if you start with what have I given. But if you ask the question, what have you given, you can see that you're pretty generous. You know, that you've provided a lot for a lot of people, a kind word, a hug. Maybe you give some charity, some money. Maybe you work to make breakfast for your sweetheart. Whatever it is, you can write this long list. But what ends up happening is after you tally up, look at what you've given and you see it on paper, and then you look at what you've received, you will undoubtedly realize that you have received far, far, far more than you could ever have given. And so again, that story is being told of gratitude. Here's the question that I find the most compelling. And it's, what trouble have I caused someone else? What trouble have I caused someone else? And what's really important about that, at least in the texts on Nikon that I've read, is that in a show note or something, I'll link to, I'll give us a name of a book, is that it's not judgmental, and the question is not meant in a judgmental way. It's not about morality. I've caused so-and-so trouble because I stole. I mean, if that's true, then name it. But you're just saying, like, you know, when I think about the things that I've caused, I mean, it could be as simple as, and as non-moral as, you know, I was late to a meeting. Traffic was bad that caused me to be late, right? It's not my fault. It's not a bad intention. I didn't mean to slight somebody, but I was nevertheless late, which then affected the calendar of so-and-so, which then affected their next appointment, and so on. But then you also do take into account your moral slights. You know, I've caused some irritation to my spouse by being curt with them this morning, or I caused someone a delay at the bank, or I caused this heartache because I caused someone heartache because I chose to change the tradition for Sunday worship, and that hurt them because tradition was so important. It doesn't mean it's good or bad or unnecessary, but you still cause, quote unquote, some trouble or some difficulty for someone else. And the part of it being not moral or not judgmental is that all you're doing is you're basically taking of your footprint in this world. Your footprint. Kind of like your carbon footprint. What do you account for? What can you account for in this world that you affect? When you start thinking through those questions deeply, it starts pulling threads and fibers at the stories you tell yourself, or the assumptions you make. So those are some really good questions that I actually do employ into my regular meditative prayer practices. So that's called Nikon contemplation. And then beyond that, I try, anytime I find a good story, a foundational story, I try to tell it as often as I can so that I can imagine it. I can imagine it without thinking about it, without working to think about it. I try to let it bubble up, like what I want it to become that habituated sort of thing in my mind so that I can just react on a moment's notice. So an example of a good story that I like to ask myself when I'm evaluating things is this life-giving or not? If you think about how we evaluate things, Alan, people want to do it with numbers all the time, economic numbers of participants, or this, that, or the other. But those questions are based on scarcity. And rather than being a scarcity thinker, I want to be an abundant thinker. That's a value that I want to cultivate. So I ask myself the question, was something life-giving or not? It only had so and so many people involved in some event or whatever, but did it produce life for people? Was it something that helped growth happen in ways that I can't even measure so easily? Does it have that hard to describe quality about it? It's hard to quantify something being life-giving, but you know it when you see it. The ground beneath the feet of said thing is verdant and lush and is producing. And that to me seems to be a more virtuous, spiritually oriented, and just healthy story to put into stories I tell. So hopefully, if I'm asking that question enough, it becomes a part of my habitual thinking, and then when I need to make decisions on the spur of the moment, I can do so along those lines, along those more holistic lines than maybe a scarcity story would let me live into and believe.
I love it.
I think that's probably enough for now. So let me. Do you have any, Alan? Before we stop, do you have any thoughts, comments, questions before?
I love this practice you're describing. I think that being conscientious enough to be able to talk about the things that you have received and given, and trouble you have caused or helpfulness that you have created, all things to bear in mind. I think that can reframe someone's attitude in some pretty powerful ways, and I think I'm going to try it tonight.
It can be a lot. That's why in the people who practice Nikon are, and oftentimes suggested to do it on a retreat. And if you have time to ever do a retreat, you can just take one question per day. It doesn't mean you can't do other practices and prayers and thoughts along the way, but these are good ones for self-reflection for sure. Well, right now, I think that there's so many ways that we can take the stories we tell, and storytelling, and we're going to look more at the spirituality of storytelling in other ways. But just given the way that things have been shaping up in our current, and the time we're recording in the current culture, I thought maybe just looking at some unexamined stories, examining them a little, or just calling to mind that there are things that we have kind of operating in our operating systems that if we analyze, maybe we can come up with some better stories that would bring us to a more whole way of thinking and connecting with each other. So for now, I will say God bless. And my prayer is that you participate in life-giving things and flourish, my friends.